Go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/online therapy to get 20% off your first month of cognitive behavioural therapy, with weekly sessions online with a therapist, in addition to worksheets, a journal, meditation and yoga videos, and unlimited messaging. There's strong evidence that CBT can help people who hoard, and accessing therapy online can be affordable and accessible. Find out more and get your discount at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/online therapy.
Now on Broadway, An Enemy of the People is a New York Times critic's pick. Jeremy Strong is one of the great actors of his generation, hails the Chicago Tribune. In a performance the Wall Street Journal praises as powerfully affecting and bitterly funny. Michael Imperioli sets off sparks, cheers The Hollywood Reporter. Victoria Pedretti is luminous, raves variety. From director Sam Gold and playwright Amy Herzog, An Enemy of the People is urgent, electrifying, and haunting, declares USA Today. An Enemy of the People, on Broadway through June 16th only.
Wow!
Nice!
Yeah!
What you're hearing are the sounds of people everywhere putting on Bombas socks, underwear, and T-shirts made from absurdly soft materials that feel like plush clouds. Yeah, that plush. And the best part? For every item you purchase, Bombas donates another to someone facing homelessness.
Bombas. Big comfort for everyone. Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST. Code ACAST.
Hey there, it's Michelle Norris. I'm host of a podcast called Your Mama's Kitchen. When I travel, I'm usually looking for a way to find a taste of home when I'm not at home. And one of the things I love to do when I am at home is entertain. And Airbnb allows me to do that. When I was in California recently, I rented a house that had a great kitchen. And when we were sitting around the table, we were all thinking, we're in someone else's house. Someone could be in all of our homes as well. If you have a home, but you're not always at home, you have an Airbnb. Your home might be worth more than you think. Find out how much at airbnb.com/host.
Welcome to the Overcome Compulsive Hoarding with That Hoarder podcast. I am drowning in stuff and trying to find a way out. Listen as I explore the issues and delve deep as somebody profoundly affected by hoarding disorder. Find out more, including links to subscribe to the podcast and all of my social media at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Finally, I am not a doctor. I am just a hoarder doing her best. So do seek professional support if and when you need it. So I am here with Hannah Raila. Hannah is an assistant teaching professor at UC Santa Cruz and holds an adjunct faculty appointment at Stanford University School of Medicine. Her research looks at the connections between emotion and cognition, with a particular interest in visual information. I invited her onto the podcast because of recent research she was involved in about whether virtual reality can help with hoarding disorder treatment, which sounded so intriguing that I just couldn't resist getting in touch. Hannah, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Happy to be here.
Good, thank you. So how did you end up working in psychology research, and where did your interest in emotions and cognitions come from?
I started working, I actually, my mother was a middle school math teacher. And so I initially thought I might want to be a teacher, and I knew I loved psychology. And so then I learned that, I realized that you could become a psychology professor rather than like a psychology high school teacher. And then learned that to do that, you would have to get research experience because you had to get a PhD. So I started doing psychology research as an undergraduate, really liked it, kept doing it after undergraduate, went to a PhD program, and just, kept enjoying the research. And I think what I like about studying emotions is they're so interesting, right? They're very relatable. We all experience emotions to different degrees at different times in different ways. And so asking questions about emotion, I think really gets at a core part of humanity. That's kind of what drew me to emotion specifically.
Yeah, I interviewed a woman who is a philosophy professor with a focus on shame. And she had a similar kind of thing that everybody knows what shame is and what shame feels like. And yeah, I don't think anybody goes through life without
that. Yeah. I mean, you're getting at some of the darkest parts of the human mind when you ask clinical questions, whether it's about emotion or not. Just if you're relating to mental illness in any capacity, you're really tapping into the darker sides of the human psyche. But they are, like we're saying, very relatable, even though they are the parts of ourselves that people might not advertise to others, and they might only tell their therapist. They are feelings and human experiences that a lot of people can actually relate to.
So in your recent paper, you talk about how in-home treatment for people with hoarding disorder is not always feasible. And as a result, you tested out using virtual reality as a way for people to practice discarding their stuff virtually, as a way to provide a stepping stone to actually discarding their real stuff. First of all, where did that idea come from?
Well, we knew that in general, the idea is that we need novel treatments for hoarding because the treatments that exist, the most evidence-based treatments are grounded in cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT. And there are treatments that work for a lot of people, but certainly not everyone. And so that generally does speak to let's go out there and look at novel treatments. And so virtual reality is a tool that had been applied to a lot of other disorders. It's been used for a very long time in anxiety disorders, in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but it hadn't been tested very much at all for hoarding. And so we thought, why not see if this tool works for hoarding as well? It's working so well for these other kinds of things. Let's extend it into a new domain. And so we basically tried to design a virtual version of an in-home experience. My collaborator on the paper, who was my postdoc advisor at the time, Carolyn Rodriguez, she had run a study where they looked at how useful it was to add those kinds of in-home visits where a clinician would go to the home of someone with hoarding. It found, that they seemed to be helpful. They seemed to help folks reduce clutter more effectively in many ways. But like you just said, those kinds of in-home visits are unfeasible. So a sensible way that we could take this tool, virtual reality, that had worked well in other disorders and apply it to hoarding seemed to be to recreate those kinds of in-home visits, but in a different way.
And can you explain a bit how you went about the study? I know you connected up with a Buried in Treasures group.
Yeah, so we ran that lab was doing, this was a lab at Stanford. Carolyn Rodriguez is the principal investigator of it. She runs the lab. And so her lab had done a lot of studies using Buried in Treasures in various ways. So the Buried in Treasures group was run by clinicians in our lab. And so she had run, I don't know, this was maybe Carolyn's fourth or fifth study that used Buried in Treasures in some way. So we kind of had the practice down of running those groups. Buried in Treasures does work well. So that's an example of a treatment grounded in cognitive behavioral therapy that is pretty evidence-based for folks with hoarding.
And so you asked participants in that group whether they wanted to be involved in your virtual reality study.
Well, we recruited participants with hoarding disorder, and then we told them that if they wanted to enroll in this study, they would be getting both a Buried in Treasures group as well as virtual reality sessions. So everyone did. It was a small study, right? So it's only 9 patient participants, and all of them were in the Buried in Treasures group together, and then all of them had these individual VR sessions. So it's not like these folks were already doing a Buried in Treasures group and we asked, hey, do you also want to add virtual reality? It was if you wanted to enroll in the study, you knew you were going to get both of those.
Right, got you. And then those people, as well as attending the group, also met one-on-one and did this. So somebody came to their home initially and created a virtual world of one of their rooms, including particular items. And then with a clinician, they would use virtual reality to put themselves in that room with these items and practice, go through the motions of discarding those items.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the exercises that they were doing in the VR space were both practicing their buried and treasure skills. So for folks familiar with buried and treasures, downward arrowing is one example of a kind of core buried and treasure skill where you're asking yourself, if you're afraid of discarding this mug, why is that? What are you worried that would happen? And so that's what we mean by downward arrowing. And so some of what people are doing in VR space were those skills, but practicing them in this visual context where they feel psychologically immersed in their home. They sort of feel like they're in the room. They feel like they're actually holding that mug that they're talking about as they downward arrow it through. And then also sort of later on in the series of VR sessions, then we started to just focus on virtual discarding. So practice discarding the virtual object, place it in the trash bin, track how distressing that feels to you, practice seeing this animation of a trash truck coming to pick it up and, it's gone forever. And just try to desensitize to the distress. In the VR space, we had a charitable donation box, recycling, and a trash bin. And so some of it is trying to make decisions around like which bin is best to place this item in, which I think to folks that don't have hoarding disorder sounds simple, but it can be an overwhelming decision for wanting to make sure your items go to the perfect next place. And so you get to talk that through in the virtual space with virtual objects before, trying to go home and do it on your real items.
I loved the detail of the animated trash truck coming to take the items away. I thought that was a really nice touch. What was the benefit in making it as immersive as that?
Well, we wanted it to feel that one of the principles of this kind of approach is if you're going to desensitize to any kind of distress. So like in a spider phobia, the idea is to de-stress to being around spiders. So like a virtual treatment for spider phobia would involve being in a room full of spiders. And in order to learn how to cope with that kind of distress better, and then here, obviously, we're applying it to coping with the distress of discarding the items, you need to actually feel distressed. And so we didn't want people, obviously people know conceptually that this is not real. They know they're not really holding their mug when they're holding a virtual mug in their virtual kitchen. But we wanted it to feel as realistic as possible in order to elicit basically a high amount of distress. Because if people were just kind of like, I don't know, I guess I'm supposed to be in this kitchen, but I'm not, it doesn't feel real. And therefore this isn't really all that hard to do. We wouldn't expect that to work very well in terms of desensitization. So the trash truck was built in to try to make it more realistic and just get people live out the experience of what it's actually like to watch your items go away. Again, the main hope just being that that would be distressing enough to them that they could desensitize to that distress.
That leads really perfectly onto my next question. That could have been designed. One of the things the paper talks about is becoming more tolerant of feeling distress. And it says, unlike real-life discarding, VR provides the opportunity to discard objects over and over to facilitate desensitization. So, for example, a patient practices discarding a virtual mug, but the mug returns to practice discarding it again. In short, repeatedly rehearsing discarding with virtual possessions in VR may make real-life discarding more tolerable, and VR discarding may serve as a stepping stone to real-life discarding.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what happened in the end, isn't it? The virtual discarding, people did report that it was helping them to do real-life discarding as well.
They did, yeah. And we saw a general improvement in their hoarding-related symptoms. Both we got self-report questionnaires and they reported it being easier. And also when our study staff went into their home or zoomed into their home, because a lot of this data collection was during COVID, we saw that clutter in their home was decreasing compared to when they started. I will note, importantly, we didn't have a control group here, so we can't definitively conclude that these improvements through VR happened over and above what would have happened otherwise, right? And that's a very important caveat to note. But yeah, we did find that across our participants, they seemed to get somewhat better at discarding and be discarding more.
And this is a slight deviation, but I was really interested to see that 4 of your 9 participants were men. Other researchers into hoarding that I've spoken to have said that getting men involved in hoarding research is really difficult. And it's not that more women necessarily have hoarding disorder, just that they're more likely to put themselves forward for research. I know it's very small numbers, so it's really hard to tell, but do you think there was any particular reason that nearly half of your participants were men?
That's a good question. You're absolutely right that we do see women presenting more often for research as well as for treatment. But we don't think, there's often been this debate about how prevalent hoarding disorder is and across which demographics. And a big thing that's been hard to figure out is it really that uneven? We're seeing so many more women come into clinics around the country, around the world. But is that actually because more women have it, or they're just more willing to sign up for research and treatment? We do think it's the latter. We think that it is approximately even in men and women, like you're saying. I'm not sure, to be honest, why we had close to that 50-50 split. I mean, as close as you can get with nine people. So I'm not sure. It could be that I think that this lab at Stanford is pretty tapped into the hoarding community in the Bay Area being San Francisco and beyond. And possibly more folks were just, familiar with this lab running these kinds of studies, which maybe made it feel more approachable to sign up for this kind of stuff. Possibly also, and I think this is actually an overall benefit of the VR itself. Like I said, we don't actually know from our data whether the VR was more effective than the same kind of treatment without VR, right? But I do think anecdotally, people were really excited to be able to do a VR treatment. We had one patient who was driving 2 hours each way to attend these sessions. And I think that there's even if it's a little bit of a placebo effect, the idea of like, oh, I'm going to get this high tech intervention, virtual reality, like that's the future. I've been trying to fix my hoarding symptoms for 20 years. Maybe this VR thing will solve it. I think that kind of technology is really appealing to people and motivates them to seek treatment when they otherwise might not. And so perhaps that just applied especially to our male participants. Maybe if there's typically in men some hesitation to get treatment for this, the high-tech nature of VR being a component of treatment perhaps like attracted more of them to participate.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It might feel less like the kind of soft skills of therapy and more like, oh, this is a tech thing. I can do this. Yeah. Technology's exciting and it's cutting edge and it's just a little bit sexier than just sitting and talking to a clinician one-on-one. Yeah. But it's interesting. It stood out because that's come up a number of times with other people. Yeah. And it's still early days, obviously, for this research, and the study served to test an idea. Do you see this leading to more research? Do you see it eventually becoming an available treatment? Possibly. I think we need to first test and make sure that it works significantly better than other existing treatments, or at least as well, right? Because sometimes if you just show that a novel intervention works equally well to an established treatment, then a benefit that still provides is just providing more treatment options. And like we just said, the example of maybe the VR will attract different kinds of people to treatment. If we just show that it works as well as existing treatments, that could go a long way itself.
But that's still a big step where we would want to do a randomized controlled trial, like an RCT, on more patients, get more data before we would confidently be able to say that we should be administering this treatment nationwide. So that's like the big next step. I just got a small grant to continue developing this treatment, where actually my plan is to test it out just in kind of the normative range of difficulty discarding. Obviously, people with hoarding disorder have such an extreme difficulty discarding that it's really interfering with their life in some way. But we all struggle, or most of us struggle in some capacity to discard. Plenty of people can relate to, you went to clean out your closet and you haven't worn this sweater in 15 years, but you just can't get yourself to throw it out. And so I have some questions about the different mechanisms through which this kind of intervention might be working, where I'm going to test it out in that normative range of difficulty discarding. So I'll be starting that study this academic year. So that's the most immediate next thing that we'll be working on. And that's certainly not a randomized controlled trial on a patient population, but it will give us a little bit more information about the promise that this kind of intervention really has.
Do you want to be a de-hoarding darling? You can be now at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/darling. If you love the podcast and want a bit extra, you can finally sign up to subscribe. Members will get an exclusive monthly post with an additional top tip, some podcast and music recommendations, and a personal update from me about how things are going. Find out the full details at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/darling.
Now on Broadway, An Enemy of the People is a New York Times critic's pick. Jeremy Strong is one of the great actors of his generation, hails the Chicago Tribune. In a performance the Wall Street Journal praises as powerfully affecting and bitterly funny. Michael Imperioli sets off sparks, cheers the Hollywood Reporter. Victoria Pedretti is luminous, raves variety. From director Sam Gold and playwright Amy Herzog, An Enemy of the People is urgent, electrifying, and haunting, declares USA Today. An Enemy of the People, on Broadway through June 16th only.
Hiring for your small business? If you're not looking for professionals on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. That's like looking for your car keys in a fish tank. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't even visit other leading job sites. So start looking in the right place. With LinkedIn, you can hire professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
I think the paper mentioned this, but it's the kind of thing where at this stage, it might look cost prohibitive to roll out, but in a few years, it could be much easier to set up with just a phone and an app. Like I remember in the early days of broadband, and someone had to come to your house and set it all up, and then I changed supplier recently and they just put something in the post and I plugged it in. Like it doesn't, these things get more and more user-friendly and need less tech and less intervention often over time.
Yeah, no, definitely. We had mostly student programmers who were creating these virtual worlds using Unity. And they noted that, I think we have an estimate somewhere in the paper. I want to say it was something like about 12 hours per world was their best estimate for how much time it took them to program and design it. Obviously, we can't expect clinicians to be spending 12 hours designing a world for each of their patients. But like you noted, this technology is improving weekly almost. And so even since we started this study, it's become somewhat common for phones to have LiDAR scanning on them, which enables 3D scanning, through your smartphone in order to more patient participants could more independently create their own virtual objects to enable this like practicing discarding. So you're right, for this ever to be feasible to be happening regularly at clinics, given that it requires making individualized worlds, right? A lot of VR interventions, like I mentioned, anxiety disorders is one where it's been used for a long time, but those are more amenable to all different patients getting the same kind of VR world, right? Like if you're treating flying phobia, you just create one VR world that looks like an airplane, and then you give that to 20 people. Here, we inherently, I think, need to individualize the worlds. I guess you could argue, you could test out, if you just practice discarding the same kinds of stuff, have everyone practice discarding books, would it work? I would intuit no. I would think that it needs to be individualized. It needs to look like your actual stuff, like your actual home. And so given that that's the case here, it requires the technology making it easier to individualize those worlds before we could realistically use it. But yes, luckily that is happening. And I think I would guess in the next 10 years or so, it's actually going to be quite easy for people to, along with some help from study staff or clinicians, to almost create their own VR worlds in this kind of way.
Now, most of us won't have our homes set up in the virtual world at this point to do this kind of exercise, but is there anything we can take from it that could be useful for our day-to-day de-hoarding efforts, do you think?
I think the most useful thing is that principle of desensitizing to the distress around discarding. And that's certainly not novel, right? Lots of other treatments have established that too. Here, we were trying to do it in a virtual space, but I think that if people can cheerlead and encourage themselves to do that and practice tolerating that distress, track for yourself just how distressing it is to discard. Because often actually people anticipate that it's going to be even more distressing than it actually is. They think, oh my gosh, if I were to throw out this mug that I, love, but it's one of my 50 mugs, if I were to throw it out, it would ruin my week. I would be devastated. And then if they can actually get themselves to do it, it's not quite as devastating as they predict. And one way we can track that is by actually writing down the numbers. Rate your own distress on a scale of 0 to 10. If you predict it's going to be a 10, actually throw it out and then track how distressed you feel and how long that lasts. And my guess is by the next day, and even by the next hour, perhaps after you discard it, you're not going to be as bothered by it as you predicted. And with practice, it's like a practice makes perfect mentality. The more we practice tolerating that distress, letting it feel really uncomfortable, and then in an arc-like way, the distress goes way up and it sort of slowly comes down. The more I practice going through that process, the better I'm going to get at tolerating it. And then the more I'll be able to discard. And then hopefully the more I will declutter my home. So I think that's a core takeaway that people without certainly a virtual space can still enact is to practice that desensitization.
Yeah, I think if you're noting down how distressed you think you're going to be and then how distressed you are, once you've done that 5 times or 10 times or 20 times, then next time you say, oh, I can't get rid of this, I'll be really distressed. You have so much evidence then that, okay, I always think that, and actually it's rarely as bad as I think it's going to be.
Exactly. Yeah. You become kind of like a scientist in your own life, like collect data on yourself, and then you can more accurately predict how hard it will be to discard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was thinking as you were talking was something that I find really helpful is I start with the stuff that for me is easy to get rid of. If I come across something that I know is for me hard, I just think I'll do that another time because there's plenty else to be getting on with.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like by doing that, I'm practicing getting stuff out and I'm practicing donating things or throwing things away. And by the time, should I ever get to the end of the things that for me are relatively easy to get rid of, I've done all that practice and desensitization so I can move up a level to the next level of hard. And I've kind of been exercising that muscle for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a great way to think about it. Part of the hope with the virtual reality idea is that those relatively easier items we can also help people kind of move up that ladder of difficulty by working in some of the virtual discarding, because it's going to be lower on the ladder than the real life discarding, pretty much inevitably. So yeah, I think that's a great approach.
And what's next for you? I know you said a bit about continuing this virtual reality work. What are you working on at the moment?
Yeah, so we'll be getting that study up and running shortly. So I have a relatively new lab of my own at UC Santa Cruz, and so I have to, order all the virtual reality equipment that I was using in this study at this lab at Stanford. So that's like the immediate next step for that study is honestly just figuring out the equipment, designing the study, exactly how many participants do we want, what questionnaires are we going to use, all those kinds of study design questions. I'm also in my lab now running, I study not only hoarding disorder, but hoarding disorder is lumped into this category of obsessive compulsive and related disorders. And so I also, in my work, answer questions related to OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So I'm actually doing a study more related to OCD, where we are looking at whether people who kind of vary in terms of contamination fears, which again varies in like a normative way, just across community samples, whether or not you have OCD. Some people are have higher contamination fears. We're going to look at if that predicts how quickly images related to sort of disgust and lack of cleanliness, how quickly they pop through into your visual awareness. Because folks that have high contamination fears sort of report this phenomenological experience of, oh, the mess just jumps out at me, right? If I glance around the room, I just can't help but see, the dust in the corner or the disarray on the desk. Whereas people who don't feel that way, they're like, I don't know, I'm looking around the room, I didn't notice anything. So we're actually creating a visual paradigm to see if that unorganized, unclean visual stimuli do actually make it into people's visual awareness more readily if they're higher on those kinds of contamination fears. So a really different kind of question than we're asking here about hoarding disorder, but that's just another project that my lab has been doing recently.
Really interesting. Really interesting.
Thanks.
And if people want to find you online, do you have a website, social media, anything like that?
Yeah, sure. So I have a website. It's hannahraila.com/lab. Goes over a little bit what my lab studies. So HANNAHRAILA.com/lab. That's a good website to go to. And yeah, happy to be in touch with folks if they're interested in chatting about this.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Really, really interesting.
Great. Yeah. Thank you.
Do you have any burning questions you'd love me to answer? My first Q&A episode was really popular, and so I'm open now to more questions. Contact me on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or plain old email. All the links are on my website at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Ask me anything and I'll do my best to answer. Shout out this week to the Financial Confessions podcast and this interview with Paige Pritchard. Have a listen while she talks about when we want to buy something to start a new activity.
Consumer culture that we live in wants to tell us that products have the ability to give us a whole new personality and to give us a whole new identity. And so we actually go out spending our money buying these things thinking that it's not only am I buying a new pair of running shoes, I'm buying myself a whole new personality, a whole new identity as this person who runs. When in actuality, the identity that you're looking for or that personality that you're trying to aspire to step into, a lot of the times comes from one of two things. It comes from your mindset, and it also comes from action, right? Taking action. And a lot of times, let's just stick with this running example. It's what's going to give you the identity as a runner is for you to actually go out and start running. I see this a lot with organizational products or productivity products as well, right? Planners or, those cute little organizational bins. It's kind of if you want to start journaling, you don't need the $60 pretty leather-bound, monogrammed journal to get you to start journaling. Because ultimately, like to your point, what you're after is an identity. And how you're going to form that identity is through actually journaling. So again, going back to like giving yourself the proof before the purchase. I'm like, the proof is what is actually going to give you the thing that you're looking for, which is kind of this new personality, this new identity, this new embodiment as somebody who now does fill in the blank. And what's going to give you that is by actually doing it.
It's true. You don't become a runner by having the right shoes. You become a runner by running. Okay, thank you for listening, and I will speak to you next time. Thank you for listening to the Overcome Compulsive Hoarding with That Hoarder podcast. You can find more online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. You can find me on Twitter at That Hoarder and on Facebook at Overcome Compulsive Hoarding with That Hoarder. To find out more about how you can support the podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support and do subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss any future episodes. There may be links in this podcast that earn me money. This doesn't come at any extra cost to you if you ever make a purchase through the links, and it helps to support the future of the podcast.
Now on Broadway, An Enemy of the People is a New York Times Critics' Pick. Jeremy Strong is one of the great actors of his generation, hails the Chicago Tribune. In a performance the Wall Street Journal praises as powerfully affecting and bitterly funny. Michael Imperioli sets off sparks, cheers the Hollywood Reporter. Victoria Pedretti is luminous, raves variety. From director Sam Gold and playwright Amy Herzog, An Enemy of the People is urgent, electrifying, and haunting, declares USA Today. An Enemy of the People, on Broadway through June 16th only.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
Hey, y'all. I'm Erin Haynes, editor-at-large for the 19th News and a journalist who has spent the last 20 years working hard to tell the truth. I'm also a Black woman born and raised in the South, so I've seen how often journalists get stories wrong. That's why I decided to start The Amendment, a weekly podcast where I talk to folks with unique perspectives to try to get at the truth behind the biggest stories of our day. Whether that means talking to Wesley Morris about the politics behind the Oscars.
I do spend a lot of time thinking about, wonder how this would have gone if Anatomy of a Fall was about a Black woman.
Jail. Or Nicole Hannah-Jones about the stakes of our election.
We have to figure out how to not just cover Trump, but all of the ways that democracy is being eroded.
Tune into The Amendment. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.